Hey there, and welcome back to the third and final part of this wee thing I've been doing called Remaking the JRPG, where I'm taking a look at 3 JRPGs released in the last few years that have taken clear inspiration from JRPGs of the past, and seeing how well they hold up compared to the games they're emulating, and how they fare in the more modern gaming landscape. This time around we're having a closer look at Octopath Traveler, and with this being the third and last video in this little series, you should pop back and check out the first 2 videos on Setsuna and Lost Sphear if you haven't already, because it'll really help to contextualize this one. That being said, I'll briefly explain the parameters with which I'm judging this game. I've tried to narrow down the most important aspects of a good classic JRPG into 4 categories, which you can see on the screen now, and we'll be taking these one by one and focusing on what makes Octopath tick. At points I'll be comparing it to other games from the past, and sometimes to Setsuna and Lost Sphear too, to try and help further with giving this game the appraisal it deserves. So, let's not mess about I guess, time to dive right in. First of all, I should provide a bit of background for this game. Octopath Traveler was developed by Square Enix themselves and published by Nintendo for the Nintendo Switch. Interestingly enough, the 2 primary producers for this game, Masashi Takahashi and Tomoya Asano, both worked on Bravely Default, and Takahashi himself said at Japan Expo this summer that, in terms of game mechanics, if Bravely was a spiritual successor of Final Fantasy V, Octopath has been developed as a spiritual successor of Final Fantasy VI. This is really interesting because this influence can absolutely be seen throughout, but Octopath isn't simply a rerun of Square's SNES glory days. To see how, let's have a look into its plot, and in particular its narrative structure, and hopefully get a better idea of what this game has to offer. And again, kinda goes without saying, but spoilers, be careful. Octopath Traveler has a plot structure that differs from most of your classic JRPGs in the sense that story progression is non-linear and is dependent on the player's choice. Arguably the most stressful moment of Octopath is the first thing you do, which is pick your personal protagonist from 8 different characters scattered around the map. Your choice matters because this character has to remain in your party for nearly the entire time you play the game, so it is something you have to choose wisely. These 8 characters each have their own specific narrative threads to follow, which are spread over 4 chapters, taking you on a journey each time from one end of the world to another. And as the name of the game suggests, your aim is pretty much to collect your 8 travelers and make your way through their stories. It's an interesting way to construct a game, and I can't think of many comparisons from the off. From what I know, Romancing Saga, released in Japan way back in 1992, has a similar idea of choosing from one of 8 main characters, but I haven't actually played the game, so I don't really feel qualified to make any big claims on that. If there is a comparison I can make here though, I would say it's to the latter half of Final Fantasy VI, in particular the World of Ruin. If you don't overcomplicate the process too much, going through places in the world and hoovering up your party members is more or less the idea for every JRPG under the sun, but Octopath does mix it up a smidge by making recruitment pretty optional, and this is something I think you see more in games from the SNES era of JRPGs. I'm pretty sure that of Final Fantasy VI's extended cast of party members, Mog, Shadow, Gogo, and Umaro are all technically missable, and if we do go back specifically to the World of Ruin where the point is collecting up your scattered teammates, there's no definitive instruction or technicality which means you need to get everyone. Octopath is similar in a way, and I would argue a bit kinder. No one is strictly missable in this game, but the options are there to focus only on half the characters if that's what you want to do. Octopath isn't the kind of game to punish you for not waiting until the last 10 seconds on the floating continent, if you get what I mean. As to whether this choice is a good thing, I would say yes. I don't think I'd ever play this game without getting everyone and everything, but I like that element of choice to an extent, because you can take this game from whatever angle you like. The main thing stopping complete player freedom here is the deliberate pacing of the game's chapters, because the game's design does technically fit a certain way of playing best, which is pretty much going around and playing everyone's first chapter, and then second, and then third, and so on. The way it does this is by modifying the difficulty of each chapter with a suggested level, which stops you completing one character's story all at once. This is something that I imagine would bother some people playing the game who are more inclined towards having absolute agency and freedom in their approach to games like this, and I think that's a fair way to look at it, to be honest. From a personal perspective though, I actually think it's pretty smart. It's more like guidelines than rules, and I think it gives the game, if you go along with the suggested levels, the right amount of challenge. I've heard at points that people weren't fond of this structure because it created a sort of narrative dissonance, where you played a bit of one story, and then another, and by the time you got back to the first, you weren't really sure what was going on. I mean, this is never a problem I personally had in the game because the stories are all markedly different, and I feel like if you've ever experienced media with multiple concurrent plotlines, this in particular shouldn't be too difficult to follow. I'll get into what I think about the actual plots themselves in a second, but before that it's worth touching on what maybe the least engaging aspect of this game is, and that's the very specific chapter structure. I really like this game generally, and I didn't even mind this too much, but it's a complaint I don't feel justified at all in refuting. The chapters in this game are all pretty much structurally identical. This can be boiled down to, in I think every instance bar one, speaking to someone in a town, doing something character specific, getting a bit of exposition or plot development, then heading to a nearby dungeon and taking down the boss. Because of this, I think the most justified complaint about this game would be that it's often mechanically repetitive. At points it is a bit tedious, but at least from a personal perspective I don't think it's nearly enough reason to write the game off entirely. I guess it depends on specific preferences, but how fantastic the writing is in the game, both in the sense of narrative progression and individual characters, lifted this tedium for me. I was wholly aware that nigh every chapter was the same thing with a different name, and I did not care. Why? Well, because it's still good. Even when it wasn't at its best, it was by no means bad. This repetition blends perfectly alongside genuinely engaging and at points riveting storylines, character writing that's some of the best I remember seeing in a while, and combat which only gets better and better the more you play. Sure, annoyance about this is technically justified, and I won't tell you you're wrong if you disagree with me, but I think we just had two distinct and separate experiences. As a result of this, I don't think it would be fair to call the game fragmented or lacking in depth, because the depth is there when you look. Each individual story holds water on its own, and around the time of everyone's last chapter, clues do start appearing. The same name, Graham Crossford, turns up in disparate storylines that have to this point no connection, as well as repeated reference to some sort of gate in the others, and all the while there seems to be something suspicious and malicious bubbling under the surface regarding an evil deity that had been banished and sealed away. I've read a fair few reviews on this game now, and a common complaint bandied about is that it's just a shame that there's no single element unifying the stories. And there is. There's an entire epilogue in which you concretely see how each of the 8 stories and characters combine and unify, and it's there for the taking if you look. I feel like this is a game generally where you get back what you put in. It isn't like Lost Sphear or I Am Setsuna where you're just along for the ride and both agency and development are minimal. If you put the time into Octopath, pay attention to its stories, to its dialogue, and embrace what main and optional content the game offers you, it will pay dividends. It's so smart because each chapter plants these little seeds of intrigue that keep you engaged, and these blossom as you progress, making sure that you always want to know what's coming next. The design seeps into the stories themselves, and this is for me the ultimate way in which this game is an homage to its JRPG influences. Octopath's narrative may be structurally simple in a way, but it does not directly spoon-feed you its content and it does not hold your hand. You play a role in it too. It isn't a game that naturally desires to exclude, but the more you pay attention, the more you explore, and the more you give to this game and its plot, the more you get back. Maybe that isn't for everyone, and that's okay. For me though, it's definitely a positive. And with that dealt with, let's pop over to the characters in this game and their individual stories and see what they have going for them. To start things off, let's look at who these characters are. Each of them have a base class connected to their personality and background, aligning themselves with something recognisable and established from the genre's history. There's Ophelia, the cleric, Cyrus, the scholar, Tressa, the merchant, Ulberic, the warrior, Primrose, the dancer, Alfin, the apothecary, Therion, the thief, and Hanit, the huntress. It's your classic eclectic combo, all of whom are very well voice acted too, by the way, not to mention written remarkably convincingly thanks to their own distinct idiolects and dialects. However, as I mentioned in the last video, a slight suspension of disbelief is almost necessary for JRPGs because they do tend to push the boat out a smidge with party believability. Even though these characters do not have, at least initially, one major goal they're collectively working towards, the way they present themselves throughout, and the way that they occasionally interact through short little vignettes, manages to create a cohesive party environment, in spite of not having a game structure where party interaction is a priority. I ended up choosing Ophelia as my protagonist. I found her story and her character and her design appealing from the get-go, and I liked the idea of starting in a cozy wee snowy area too. And what I really like is that through how clearly and profoundly each character's identity was portrayed, as well as through short conversations with each character, I quickly gained an understanding of how these characters thought of one another and interacted with one another. For example, Therion is often quite short with Ophelia and expresses a kind of subtle disinterest in her kind-heartedness, which is bolstered through the occasional story vignettes. However, even if these interactions didn't exist at all, I would still know what their rapport was, and I don't need it to be made uncomfortably obvious. At points it does seem odd that the honourable Ulberic and the candid, old-fashioned Hanit would be working alongside an unashamed villain in Therion, and I guess it is if you really think about it, but it's each story and each character's uniqueness that makes this distinction unimportant to me. If you really get into the technical logistics of each story chapter, it is a bit confusing. All other characters aside from the one in question are absent from the relevant story except for in battle, and if you think that technically they should be there, you're not wrong, but I don't think that's really what the point is. I don't think suspension of disbelief is usually a good argument, especially if you use it more than once, because then it just seems that the content's silly, but I don't think the idea behind having character-specific stories is to imagine how the other characters would act in that given situation, but rather to have a specific focus on the individual. I don't really care what Tressa thinks about what's unfolding in Primrose's story, for example. I care what Primrose thinks, though. A lot of Octopath's strength comes from how clear this direction is, and I think having multiple other characters involved in each story would really muddle it up, and it would ruin a lot of the poignancy and the emotional impact of each story if it wasn't to do with just the one character. It is a really risky and perhaps somewhat off-piste design choice, which I'm sure might not sit well with some, but I think it works because it opens the door for numerous instances in which you really care about a particular character. Not many JRPGs help you foster affection for literally every member in your retinue, but that's one of Octopath's primary goals. Having characters kind of sit on the sidelines, as logistically improbable as it may be, almost unbelievably makes character development and story progression better, by making the link between the story and character in question so indelible and permanent. Even though Ophelia was my protagonist, and I think she's wonderful, I'd like to focus on some of the other characters and their stories. As good as they all were, and despite the attention I'd like to give them all in this video, I'd like to look at Alphen and Primrose in particular. JRPGs are commonly known for taking on big themes, and Octopath is no exception. Perhaps the most noteworthy example throughout this whole game is Primrose. Primrose was born the heir to a noble house, and the untimely murder of her father when she was young drove her from her life as she knew it, and into a much harder path. When we meet her, she's a dancer, essentially a sex worker, tolerating a life of abuse and misery and biding her time in order to give her the best opportunity to come across and hunt down her father's killers. Primrose suffers quietly, knowing that in time her opening will appear and that she'll be vindicated for the pain she's been made to endure. The game explains this all in a much less ham-fisted way than me, but what's important here is how rare it is that ideas like this are explored in depth throughout video games as a whole. Every story in Octopath is quite adult in theme and deals with mature topics, if you will. Having a character with a background in prostitution and not shying away from this is an example of tangible progress in how games approach difficult themes. This can be seen with Alphen too, who is my favourite character in the game and who also had my favourite story. Alphen is an apothecary, and this is because he's following in the footsteps of another travelling apothecary who saved him as a child. As a result, he is dedicated to helping out anyone he can, regardless of whether they can reimburse him for his assistance, or whether they even deserve the help. Alphen's willingness to be of service, to help the weak, and to do the right thing ends up being the source of one of my favourite narrative threads in the whole game. Alphen witnesses another apothecary refusing a dying man treatment, and believing that all lives are worth saving, he steps in to do what he believes is right. After treating this guy, it's revealed that he's a criminal, and Alphen's actions in saving his life lead to the subsequent kidnap and injury of a young child. After this, Alphen's staunch and steadfast philosophy wavers, and the questions asked in the remainder of his story are just fantastic. This novel and direct perspective on enormous questions like, are all lives worth the same amount, and do some people deserve to die, is absolutely fantastic and brave too. However, even though I've picked two out, this game does a really amazing job of making sure that no character or story takes precedence over another. This is one of the best things about having an ensemble cast, 8 characters that are all in a sense the protagonist of their own stories, which again rings somewhat true to Octopath's biggest influence, Final Fantasy VI, in which you could genuinely debate who the main character is meant to be. If we look at the 2 previous games I delved into, Setsuna and Lost Sphear, this balance doesn't exist. Some characters a little more than decoration, some plot threads a little more than a momentary distraction. Some more traditionally structured JRPGs like that manage this balance too, but Octopath uses elements from the past as well as new ideas to carve a niche into how characterization works in the modern JRPG. I liked some characters more than others, obviously, and some storylines more than others too, but this game was a wonderful example of giving its content equivalent chances to stand out and shine. This depth and breadth of character types, and that they all have equal developmental opportunities, makes Octopath a game that just keeps delivering time after time. For me at least, Octopath offered one of the freshest and most honest ways to experience character and plot that I've seen in ages, and I do think it deserves credit. So let's move along to combat and see how that fares. Well, first of all, let's be relieved that this one isn't a Chrono Trigger ripoff. The combat in Octopath Traveler is the single most unifying aspect of its gameplay, thanks to how multifarious it is as an experience throughout the whole game. It's a perfect showcase for each character to show what they're about, and for the designers to show what they can offer with their unbelievable enemy and boss sprite work, and of course for the battle system itself to shine through. Octopath merges old and new with aplomb thanks to its combat. It's immediately familiar from the SNES era with a side-to-side display of you on the right and enemies on the left, but with a lot more going on than it would initially seem. There we have the old and the basics and the recognisability, but the new comes from the inspiration Octopath has taken to make this battle system its own. It's so easy to pick and choose the best bits from other games and have it come off kind of like plagiarism, which is a bit more like what we encountered in Setsuna and Lost Sphear. This time round, the inspirations are evident, but are also sufficiently different as to not verge on taking the piss. If you take the turn order system from Final Fantasy X, the elemental guessing game braking system from Persona, and then improve upon the brave aspect of Bravely Default by making extra actions develop passively, and then slap all that onto a brilliantly balanced job system with which you're afforded the ability to customize between 8 main jobs and 4 late game extra special jobs, pretty much however you want to, well then you're onto a winner, aren't you? Every component of this combat system works so cohesively, and as you play you don't think things like, well this is just Bravely Default, or this is just like Persona, because Octopath injects such individuality and life into the battles that it just feels like the turn-based combat system we know well has been rejigged and reworked to exist in a more modern setting. Battles take a wee while sometimes, but they don't feel slow and ponderous. Battles are also quite difficult sometimes, but never really frustrating, and often achievable with the abilities you have at your command. The effort that went into balancing and perfecting this combat system is genuinely palpable and deserves a lot of credit. The sheer number of ways you can approach any given combat situation is beyond most other JRPGs I can think of, and invites and encourages experimentation. Each class can equip certain weapons, and alongside the 6 different magical elements that you can use, customization becomes a part of the routine. You start trying to optimize your job and equipment loadouts to make sure that you can cover as much ground as possible in battle, and the combat develops as the game goes on, meaning that some jobs become more useful the further on you are. At the earlier points of the game, having a scholar is pretty much a given because of how useful those basic elemental spells are early on, and I found Merchant to be the least immediately useful class. Yet by the end of the game it was often a staple in my team because of how useful I found some of its abilities, in particular Hired Help, which lets you use a variety of breaking attacks you might not otherwise have active access to. Thanks to a variety of passive abilities you can unlock and class-specific special abilities, battling and mixing and matching becomes inherently rewarding, and that's what we're after. This sort of smart design means that combat never gets static and uninspiring, which is one of the most common missteps JRPGs can make. It's not surprising to have a lull in combat-based interest, maybe about halfway to 2/3 of the way through a game, because it often starts to feel kind of samey. Another thing Octopath does really well to nip that in the bud is really intelligent difficulty scaling. The game is always the right amount of challenging, provided you don't spend ages grinding and you rotate your party members, but the best way to express how detailed this game's approach is very early on. When you start the game and do your protagonist's first chapter, the boss is a challenge but beatable with just one person. When you get subsequent party members, the difficulty adapts to fit however many people you've recruited so far. It's such a stylish and appealing way of giving you absolute control over which order you initially form your party. I started at the north of the map, and my first party was Ophelia, Harnett, Cyrus, and Therion, but if I'd gone to Therion 3rd instead of 4th, the combat would have subtly matched my current setup. The overwhelming impression I got from Octopath's combat is that it wants you to enjoy it, but it doesn't want to be a walk in the park. Having its pacing be so closely monitored and specified throughout gives an initial impression of being overbearing, but the further you get into it, the more you realise that it's just incredibly well-considered design. The myriad ways you can approach a battle when you're in the thick of it is where the best of the battle system lies, and later on when every turn is of utmost importance, the sheer satisfaction and gratification you get from victory is testament to the lovingly crafted manner with which the developers have made this combat system. There's a lot that could still be said too. I didn't go into detail on each character's specific ability, like how Harnett can recruit monsters and how Therion can steal, but this video needs to keep moving, and so we're going to move on to the final topic, which deals with the world and environment of Octopath Traveler and how we engage with it as a player. I've spoken before in this video about how well this game blends old and new, and this is also clear to see in this game's appearance. I'd be lying if I said I expected a lot graphically from Octopath, but it delivered far more than I was expecting it to. Probably the biggest thing Octopath has going for it is the fact that no other game around looks quite like it, and being able to break this ground through integrating the nostalgia of 16-bit graphics is frankly remarkable. The game blends wonderful and emotive sprites with a more detailed, tilt-shifted background aesthetic. 2D and 3D graphics coexist here in harmony, working off each other to give an impression of a living, breathing, dynamic world. The light and shadow effects are remarkable, and at points it feels like you're playing a pop-up book, which is actually something you can buy as a collector's edition, by the way. And also it's like, this game actually looks like what SNES JRPGs looked like at the time to people who played them when they came out. As I mentioned in the last video about Lost Sphear, a wide variety of locales and areas is common JRPG fare, and Octopath doesn't disappoint here. The game is split into 8 distinct regions with 3 major areas in each of them. My personal favourites are the Frostlands and the Riverlands, both of which use snow and water respectively to wonderful effect to help build up the sense of atmosphere. I tend to like snowy areas in games, which is partly why I was so keen on Setsuna's aesthetics too, but each one of Octopath's areas is impressive in its own way, and saying that the Frostlands was a favourite of mine was just sheer personal preference. The woodlands have a lovely charm to them, for example, and the music in each of these areas perfectly matches the tone that the game wants to portray. The music for this game was composed by Yasunori Nishiki, who I'd never heard of before this game, and I'm very grateful I have now because the music in Octopath Traveler is just phenomenal. Really outstanding. As a little tangent, I'm going to go on record now basically as saying that Nobuo Uematsu is basically my favourite person to have ever existed. I think he's a genius, and I don't need to go on about all the reasons why. But one thing he manages to do in particular more than anyone else is create soundtracks where every song is so individually memorable, where it seems like only that song could match that moment in the game so perfectly, where the music fits so seamlessly, seems so inextricably linked to the game and the situation where it plays, yet is also endlessly listenable and enjoyable outside of that context too. Octopath Traveler's soundtrack comes really close to this, and I can't express how high I'm intending that praise to be. The music in this game just feels homely, and the inspiration is clearly there. Musically, it just ends up being an absolute triumph. It manages to do what the best JRPG soundtracks do, while still being distinctly Octopath, be it in town themes, character themes, battle themes. It's all there, and it's all done so well. I'm also relatively sure, by the way, just as a wee aside, that I can hear a little bit of Corridors of Time in the Swarky town theme. So please go and listen to that and check if I'm just hearing things or not. Anyway, as for Octopath's practical design, I found it to be pretty good. Dungeons and caves and all that stuff are suitably spooky, full of winding paths and treasure. The game uses its depth of field to good effect sometimes, teasing a treasure chest with no immediately obvious path towards it, which makes you want to have a bit more of an explore, turning even basic JRPG mechanics into something even slightly more appealing. When you get down to it though, a lot of these dungeons are quite linear, which might be a drawback depending on what you're after personally. Towns are full of character, all individual enough to not be confused for one another too, and filled with plenty of lively NPCs with whom you can chat, side quest, and perhaps most importantly, use path actions. So path actions are character-specific actions which let you interact with certain NPCs in a certain way. Ulbrich, being a warrior, can challenge people to a fight for example, or Cyrus, being a right smartass, can scrutinise people and collect information. This ends up playing a role in most chapters and most side quests. Most side quests in the game are pretty simple, but ultimately open-ended and without much direction. These are where the path actions come in. Someone wants an item from someone else but they can't get it, you go nick it off them. Done. A lot of them are more complex than that, but that is the basic idea. I like it because it does transcend a basic fetch quest into something a bit more multifaceted by not hand-holding. And some quests are actually quite hard to figure out, but generally I wouldn't say that it's the shining example of what side quests ought to be. There's improvement to be made. There were actually side quests in Setsuna and Lost Sphear too, but I didn't even talk about them really apart from once in Lost Sphear because there was nothing of value to say particularly. Anyway, Octopath's better side quests are ones that follow a particular NPC over a few different quests, but all in all, they're just a good way of getting some extra equipment and money. And for getting to the actual ending of the game too, but I won't give that away completely. Anyway, here we are at the finish line, so how would I sum this all up? Octopath Traveler is, above all else, a shining example of what an homage should be. Every element of this game feels thought out, polished, and not to sound too cliched, but like a real labour of love. It isn't a perfect game by any means, and definitely has elements which could be improved upon. However, the same could be said for pretty much every other good JRPG I can think of too. Why Octopath succeeds ultimately comes down to its ability to mimic a feeling, the best feeling you can get in a JRPG, and that's the feeling of belonging. The relationship between the game and the player is of the utmost importance, and immediately Octopath Traveler just felt like home to me. It didn't even take until the end of my first chapter with Ophelia, I already loved it. Octopath near flawlessly bridges the generational gap between the golden age of JRPGs and modern gaming sensibilities. The most important thing about Octopath Traveler, in my opinion, is that although it feels like a recognisable and comfortable haven for those of us who've grown up on JRPGs, it has the power to instill that into a new generation of JRPG fans. I truly believe this game has the potential to do for new JRPG players what Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger did for people in the mid-90s, what Final Fantasy 8, 9 and 10 did for me as a wee kid, and I think that is such an important thing. People could maybe say that the JRPG is dying out as gaming develops, but games like Octopath Traveler help to put these claims back in their place. There is still a place for JRPGs today, even the JRPGs of old, and there are few better examples of why this is the case than Octopath Traveler. Well, there we are, remaking the JRPG, done, all 3 parts. This took a wee while for me to get done, so thank you for your patience and support, and above all, I hope you enjoyed the videos. If you did, please consider leaving a like or even subscribing to the channel, of course it really helps me out. If you agree with what I've said, or disagree, or think my accent's silly or something, leave a comment and let me know. Thanks again for watching, and hopefully see you next time round.